Tina Kutu, welcome everyone to our second weed biocontrol session of the Biosecurity Bonanza. Following the presentation by Robin Watt yesterday, who presented a cost-effective method to assess the impact of biocontrol agents, today we have the pleasure to welcome Simon Fowler, who will give us an overall cost-benefit analysis for weed biocontrol. Simon is an insect ecologist and a weed biocontrol researcher. Many of you will be quite familiar with Simon's face, being involved in a wide range of projects, from the introduction of dung beetles to battling the invasion of exotic species in New Zealand and over the world. Now, a quick note for the audience that anyone can put their questions in the chat. We will manage the questions at the end of the presentation, and if we run out of time, any unanswered questions will be handled offline so everyone can also get a response. This session is now being recorded, and all recordings will be available on our website, we hope, within the next week. If anyone would like to connect with Simon on project ideas or future opportunities, they can always find the contact on our website and search for his name. And now I will hand over to you, Simon.
Okay, thanks, Arno. I think I'll just jump straight in with this. So I'm just going to start with a little introduction to classical weed biocontrol. This can be a highly successful way to manage exotic invasive weeds, and it's basically a nature-based solution. What we do is we go to the native range of the weed, and we search for natural enemies of the weed, usually insects or plant pathogens. We go through a rigorous safety testing procedure that can take many years, and then the aim is to reunite these enemies with their host plants, in this case in New Zealand. Successes can be immensely beneficial, and they don't need any further ongoing investment, unlike, for example, ongoing chemical control or mechanical control. Just having a right. Okay, and I thought I'd just jump in also to a case study just to illustrate what we mean by this. So here's heather, Calluna vulgaris, which is a valued plant in its native Europe, where it forms a large part of heathland, lowland heathland, and upland moorland communities. But it's highly invasive in New Zealand, particularly here in Tongariro. Heather beetle was introduced as a biocontrol agent. It took quite a long time, despite it being the obvious agent to choose, and obviously a lot of that was the safety testing, ensuring it was free of disease and so on. But the end result has been quite spectacularly successful. All the grey here is dead heather killed by the heather beetle, and as we would expect from our host specificity studies, the native plants here are completely untouched and are now given a chance to recover, which is exactly what they're doing. Having painted this glowing picture of classical weed biocontrol, I'm going to throw in a couple of economic caveats here. The first one is that it requires really quite substantial upfront investment. It can be as much as $2 million per weed target, spread over a period of around 5 to 20 years. The second caveat is that actually how successful you're going to be is rather uncertain in advance, particularly with brand new programs. Historically, from a global perspective, about 50% of weed species targets have been successfully controlled. So I'm afraid that means half aren't. With that background, it's obvious that justifying this sort of long-term investment is really critical, and particularly with that 50% overall success rate. And this is why really we need an overall economic analysis of just how well we're doing from a monetary perspective. So moving quickly on to New Zealand, we're actually one of the top 5 countries that does weed biocontrol worldwide. We've done a couple of really fairly notable economic studies on pasture weeds, particularly focusing on ragwort and St. John's wort. And these have produced really very high benefit cost ratios. For ragwort, the benefit cost ratio was 860 to 1. For St. John's wort, it was over 6,000 to 1. And another way of looking at this is the annual ongoing benefits from successful biocontrol of these weeds. For ragwort, basically ongoing at a rate for 2022, we're saving the dairy industry over $40 million a year in control costs, and for St. John's wort, the figure is over 15 million a year. So huge successes against these 2 weeds in particular there. But as I said previously, what about the programs that were less successful or completely failed? And if we concentrate on things like St. John's wort and ragwort, then clearly we're guilty of cherry picking. So that's why we need an overall economic analysis. And to do this, we've got 5 steps, basically. First of all, we want to look at all the successful weed biocontrol programs that New Zealand has undertaken and determine the benefit we got per weed species. That benefit is basically the difference between the economic scenarios we make. Scenario 1 with biocontrol, scenario 2 without biocontrol. Then there's a slight caveat here, because we need to sum these benefits across weed species, but we've got to avoid double counting of benefits, and I'll come back to that in a bit more detail later. Then we need to assess how much New Zealand has actually spent on the classical weed biocontrol programs, and this includes all the unsuccessful projects in the past and all the unsuccessful agents, whether they were released or not. Then we bring all those costs forward to give a present value, and I'll go into that a bit more later. And that allows us to calculate an overall benefit cost ratio for classical weed biocontrol in New Zealand. So to begin with, then, we asked which weed biocontrol programs in New Zealand have historically produced benefits that we can measure economically. And to keep this as independent as we could, we used 2 independent reviews to shortlist 6 programs, one by Max Suckling and the other using the recently updated international catalogue of weed biocontrol. In doing this process, we excluded weed biocontrol programs in New Zealand where the impacts were low, or where the impacts were considered too recent to be assessed. The excluded programs, therefore, included several programs where we think there are incipient successes, and these will probably need to be added to this evaluation in future. And in particular, those were buddleia, Californian thistle, Scotch broom, Scotch thistle, and Tradescantia. So we have incipient successes with those, but we don't have any data, and they're all comparatively recent. So just moving on to our 6 evaluated weed biocontrol programs, 3 of those weeds were pasture weeds. So we've mentioned ragwort and St. John's wort so far. Robin covered nodding thistle in some detail yesterday. We also have one weed, an aquatic weed, which is cross-sector, so it causes problems for the natural environment, as you can see it here, invading a wetland system near Auckland, and it also causes problems on farmland in irrigation channels and so on. And then we've got two strictly environmental weeds, which have impacts on natural ecosystems. Well, I've already said something about heather, but here we also have mistflower. So these are the 6 shortlisted programs where we've had very substantial successes in New Zealand, and we're going to try and attach some economic data to those. So what are the benefits? Well, if you look at this table here, I've listed the weeds per row. There's the column 2 has the costs we managed to associate with the weeds, and in the final column off to the right is the annual control benefit as of 2022. So that's the ongoing benefit. One of the critical things here is to note that there are much more savings. In fact, over 99% of the savings in that final column off to the right are from agricultural weeds, and I'll go into that a bit more later. And what I'd like to do from this is just contrast the ongoing agricultural savings, which are in the many tens of millions there, with the annual investment in operational weed biocontrol in New Zealand, which is currently about 1.34 million. So each year we're already, from historic programs, saving a much larger amount than we're currently investing in weed biocontrol in this country. So on to that business about avoiding double counting. Double counting basically occurs if you've had successful biocontrol of a given weed species, say in a pasture system, but that successful biocontrol in itself has then made the same pastures vulnerable to a secondary invasion by another weed species, which you then also target successfully by biocontrol. You can't count both of those as simple summed benefits because it's the same pasture. If you'd been controlling those weeds with a chemical, for example, with a herbicide, then the chances are quite likely that the secondary weed invasion would never have occurred. So we checked whether any of our 6 weeds, shortlisted weeds, had invaded similar habitats and with the sort of sequential timing that you would need if you were having secondary weed invasion problems. And indeed, we found that in dryland pastures, mainly in the east of the country, it's possible that those pastures became susceptible to nodding thistle invasion in about the 80s and 90s because St. John's wort in similar pastures had been successfully controlled. Of course, we've got no data on this, but having no data never stopped a good economic analysis. So let's just launch on further. What we did then is a common little trick where we just said, well, let's invent some scenarios. So if nodding thistle was a major secondary weed, we decided that we would reduce the benefits from nodding thistle by 100%. If it was a partial secondary weed, we'd invent a scenario where we reduce the benefits by 50%. And then we stuck in 0% effectively as our control, where nodding thistle benefits would have nothing to do with it being a secondary weed. And this reflects the worst of best case scenarios. When we stick those figures in and we look at the effect of the annual savings at those 2022 rates, for all weed biocontrol working across from left to right, you can see we've got 0%, 50% and 100%. Treating nodding thistle as 100% a secondary weed does indeed make a difference, but it's only making a difference of a few tens of millions. There's still a very substantial effect going on. What you can also see here again is that the benefits from the productive sector weeds massively outweigh the rather small actual monetary benefits from environmental weed biocontrol. And by the way, there's no secondary invasion going on with that with the environmental weeds in this case, because our two environmental weeds and our one cross-sector weed weren't in the same habitats. So what about the investment in weed biocontrol in New Zealand? So what we need is a total historical investment, including the programs that succeeded or failed. That's everything. In total, New Zealand's released about 69 agent species against 28 weeds since the 1920s. So we're going back 100 years. Now, not surprisingly, if you go back historically, there's no dollar data attached to any of the details we can find, but there are fantastic historical records of these past projects. And they're really down to this gentleman in the middle there, David Miller, who was at one point director of the Cawthorne Institute, and responsible for documenting all the early New Zealand weed biocontrol projects. Given this, it's actually relatively easy to attach modern costs to these activities, because we essentially nowadays do the same things. Although I hazard to say we're not usually as well dressed as David there. And what we can then do is we can CPI adjust all those figures back to the actual year when they were incurred. So to do benefit cost ratios, what we need to do is some present value calculations. And that's because those costs and benefits were all incurred or gained over a wide range of years. So what we need to do is convert all those figures to what are called present values. And effectively what we do is we then, in any given year, we then inflate those figures at a discount rate per year, right through till the present day. And the discount rate we chose was 4% per year. Once you've done that, you can then actually sum those present values for each year. This is for the 6 programs with substantial benefits. And obviously you get different sums when you take those scenarios for secondary weed invasion into account. You can also sum the present values of the costs of the investment. And note, of course, again, that this is for all programs, all years, all agents, not just the 6 that were successful. And that then actually allows you straightforwardly to then use those 2 figures to give you the overall benefit to cost ratio. And what that comes out as is that the final benefit cost ratio for all New Zealand weed biocontrol is somewhere between 52 to 1 and 73 to 1, depending on the secondary weed invasion issue. And those are really very impressive benefit cost ratios. What they mean in simple terms is that for every dollar invested in weed biocontrol, New Zealand's seen a return of $52 to $73 on present day values. Now, if anybody offered me a return of that on a dollar, I'd be pretty chuffed. Just to contrast that to Page and Lacey, 2 Australians who did the similar sort of analysis for Australia, came out with 23 to 1. So not wildly off, and likewise their benefits were strongly dependent on biocontrol in the agricultural sector. Unlike Page and Lacey, we then went on and split our data into the agricultural and environmental sectors. And what we find is that in the agricultural sector, our benefit cost ratio is really strong, 1.55 to 1. Whereas in environmental weeds, it actually drops to 0.88 to 1, which is actually a slightly negative return. So you invest $1 and you only get 88 cents back. That kind of surprised us at the time, but with hindsight, all the economists we talked to said, well, you shouldn't have been surprised at all. But we were at the time. So why are we getting this low monetary return on the biocontrol of environmental weeds? Well, the first reason is that the data are actually really difficult to source. You've got a diverse range of stakeholders with problems with these weeds, and we found that particularly with mistflower and alligator weed. It's very hard to get the data. Often what you find with environmental weeds is that control efforts have been abandoned because the weed has turned out to be intractable, the control methods are ineffective, or the side effects of the control methods are too damaging. And that we've shown that very clearly with heather, for example. You may also find that weeds have been targeted very early in their spread, and that was certainly true with mistflower, which means that it's actually very hard to get a handle on the costs without some quite fancy modeling. But the main issue that stands out is that it's challenging to monetize the benefits of weed biocontrol of environmental weeds, because the benefits are largely improvements in biodiversity or ecosystem services. That's the main reason you're trying to manage these weeds anyway. And it's very hard to attach strictly monetary benefits to those benefits. So what solutions have we got? Well, the obvious one would be to try and actually value the biodiversity gain or the improvements to ecosystem services. I'll give a bit more of that on the final slide. We could use chemical mechanical control costs for what the control costs would actually be to completely suppress an environmental weed rather than what's actually being expended. And we do have that figure for heather. It's been estimated at 2022 figures again that you'd have to be spending approaching $2 million a year to achieve heather control, and that's regardless of the side effects you might get. But obviously it's open to the criticism that it's an unrealistic cost. I don't think DOC or the New Zealand Defence Force, which also has heather on its land, would even dream of spending that sort of money. We can reduce the 4% discount rate a bit. E.g., there's the Turpie in South Africa suggested this would be a sort of social discount rate of 3%. You can embrace longer time frames for your benefit cost studies. This all helps. You can try alternative methods to cost benefit analysis. You can use multi-criteria analysis, which is actually a really useful way to semi-quantitatively decide between different strategies in weed biocontrol, but it's not a benefit cost analysis. And actually, the New Zealand Biosecurity Act requires cost benefit analyses for assessing weed management strategies. So politically, we're kind of stuck with that. So what about valuing biodiversity gains? Just going straight for the jugular here. There's actually been some really good research in South Africa looking at ecosystem service benefits from successful weed biocontrol. But when you drill down into what they've actually done, you find that a massively big proportion of their studies involve things like the provision of water or grazing services from their protected areas. So their protected areas are actually grazed quite substantially, and there are other uses too. None of these are really particularly relevant to most or all of the environmental weed control or weed biocontrol in New Zealand. The South Africans did talk about what they term a biodiversity intactness index, and there are methods within this which are relevant to New Zealand, and these are contingent valuations of non-use values of biodiversity. Contingent valuations are when you ask people to value biodiversity, e.g. by their willingness to pay. Do they like it? Do they, and so on. But there's plenty of room for bias and debate in the way you interpret these things and actually build them into a genuine cost-benefit analysis. So just to finish, we've got ongoing research in this. We'd really like to explore the valuation of weed biocontrol in particularly using heather as a system in Tongariro National Park, given the recognized cultural, geological and geographical and biodiversity stroke ecosystem service values of the park, which of course were critical to it being identified as a World Heritage Site. So that's the end. Thanks to all the people who provided data and funding and generally helped. Thank you.
Great talk, Simon. Thank you very much. So what people can start writing their questions in the chat. I do have one for you. So most of the cost for weeds that you have presenting is around cost of control. I understand that it's very difficult to measure the biodiversity or the ecosystem losses, but do you have any other measure or cost that you have not taken into account in your analysis?
Well, yes, there are quite a few actually, because we were limited really to control costs. So, for example, for ragwort, we know that there will be losses associated with stock poisoning, and those flow on to associated milk production reductions in milk production, and also but we've got no real data on that. And also for ragwort, we only covered the dairy sector, and obviously ragwort affects beef cattle, sheep, and it's particularly poisonous to horses. So there are other sectors that makes our overall data for ragwort we think quite conservative.
I see. A question from Lauren Lima. It might be a bit tricky to answer, but have these historic locations been mapped even approximately? So when you were presenting some of our historic locations back in the 1920s,
Yep.
do we have any record?
Well, yeah, we do actually. So, for example, with St John's wort, we know that the beetles were first released in the Awatere Valley, and we know the month and we know the year. I think the year was 1943, and we know that they weren't really quantitatively monitored, but we know that they demolished the stands, really extensive stands of St John's wort within two or 3 years. So we do have some remarkably good data, but of course then it does tend to thin out, because then farmers, for example, in that case, tended to start to move the beetle around themselves, and we don't have a record of the extent of that really.
Right. Question from Maxim Polyakov. How did you estimate the benefits of controlling environmental weeds?
Well, what we've really done there is we've just looked at reductions in control costs. So if we take heather, for example, we know from the Department of Conservation and the New Zealand Defence Force that they were spending around $120,000 in, and those are 2022 adjusted figures, but they were busy trying to control heather particularly for the Defence Force, between 91 and 97. So we have that information, and in fact that information was actually used in the application to early information similar was used in the application to release the heather beetle. So it's in the grey literature, but it is published.
I see. Question from Ewan Baker. What about positive externalities? For example, a pollinator increase as a result of weed control, increasing ecosystem function and the ecosystem health with regards to quantifying cost analysis.
Okay, well, I mean, we certainly are aware that that weeds can be important sources of pollen, and that weeds, I guess, would have an ecosystem effect of increasing pollinators. But it's actually, when you start to get knock-on effects like that, effectively in food webs, or in this case in pollination webs, it gets extremely difficult to predict what's going on. So whether having a weed present with a massive burst of flowering, say broom in spring, would actually suck pollinators away from pollinating native plants, or would attract pollinators in a beneficial way, is going to be really, really hard to study. I mean, it'd be a fascinating thing to look at, that's for sure. Yeah.
Right. And perhaps the last question from the audience, from Graham Lowe. What is happening with gorse and broom, which are production hazards, nature modifiers, and fire prone? Is that have been taking into account, or?
Yeah, well, it's funny because they're not. I mean, phylogenetically, they're reasonably closely related, but unfortunately, the success of biocontrol has been very different in those two cases. So, the weed biocontrol program against broom is looking pretty good, particularly with the gall mite. The weed biocontrol program against gorse has been, frankly, a story of long-term frustration, I think. I don't think we're quite finished yet, but yeah, we haven't had a lot of success against gorse. But we are doing much better against broom, and I agree that they are both ecosystem transformers. They do a lot of nitrogen fixing, for example. So they are, and they change fire regimes. So they are major problems. They do, of course, both encourage succession through to native bush if they're managed carefully. So they do, in a sense, have a benefit there.
Yes, quite true. All right, so we are getting at the end of our session. Any questions that have not been answered will be answered directly in the chat so that we can get along with the rest of our day. Thank you again, Simon. That was a great presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I hope to see you all tomorrow for our next session. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.